Let me begin by introducing our speakers. David Caughlin is Cameron Professor HR Analytics and an instructor of management at Portland State University, where he teaches Introduction to HRM, HRIS and People Analytics, and OB. He was awarded the Teaching Innovation Award at Portland State University. Talia Bauer is Cameron Professor of Management at Portland State University and is currently the President for the Society of Industrial and Organizational Psychology. She is one of the most influential HR researchers in the world and a fellow at SIOP, APA, and APS. She is the past editor of the Journal of Management and has won major teaching awards from AOM and SIOP. She was also the first ever management scholar at Google. Talia and David are both part of the author team of the new textbook from Sage Publishing, Human Resource Management, People, Data, and Analytics. This one-hour webinar will be recorded and archived for future viewing. We will be sending out a link to view it and access the slides to all registrants in the coming weeks. If you have any problems with audio or viewing mode during the webinar, please use the Q&A box at the right of your screen and one of our team members will get back to you as soon as possible. At the end of the webinar, we will be having some time for Q&A from the attendees, so please also use the Q&A box to ask any questions to the speakers throughout the webinar. Please also take note of the webinar hashtag Sage Talks and feel free to ask questions or leave comments there as well. Now to get started, let's take a moment and get to know our audience by answering a couple of our polling questions. Okay, great. Let's move on to our second polling question. And if you have any approaches that we did not list here, feel free to put them in the Q&A box to let us know. Okay, thank you everyone for participating and telling us a little bit more about yourselves. Without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Talia and David to get us started.
So this is Talia, and thank you for joining us. We're excited to share what we've seen works in terms of teaching analytics within an HR course and why it's important. David and I started by transforming our HR information systems course into HRIS as well as HR analytics. And that was successful. We built from there, and this fall we launched a year-long 6-course graduate level certificate, as well as Sarah mentioned, publishing HRM, People, Data, and Analytics. And that's for introduction to HRM. So we've seen what works with undergrads as well as grad students across a wide range of ability levels. Our approach entails really breaking HR analytics into 3 levels of literacy, fluency, and mastery, as you see here. And what we found is that students first need a foundation of concepts, ideas, and examples of HR analytics. So it's great to see that a lot of you are already integrating case studies and examples in your teaching and in your courses. And then after that, they're ready to engage with the material to gain additional fluency in speaking to issues, understanding what's happening, and starting to be able to engage in HR analytics independently. By the mastery phase, students are ready to tackle big issues and are more sophisticated in their approaches and nimble in their HR analytics skills. When we think about what we're going to cover today, we're really going to focus in on the ideas and activities related to the literacy and fluency levels, as we find those really pair well in introductory courses. And then moving from there, if you're interested, there are additional courses that could be offered in terms of depth of material that gets at mastery. At this point, I'm going to hand things off to David, who'll go over the outline for today. David?
Thank you very much, Talia, and thank you everybody for attending today. And it was great to see everybody's responses, and it looks like we have a good variety in terms of how people are applying HR analytics through case studies, as Talia mentioned, as well as through some data exercises as well. So the focus of today's presentation is going to be briefly how did we get there in terms of the field of HR, and then we'll offer a brief definition and treating HR as a science and how to get students excited about that. And then the bulk of the presentation will be on training students, and we'll give some examples using the approach that we found helpful and drill down to some examples from the textbook that are data exercises, case study or cases, as well as some pop-out boxes that you might find useful. And we'll finish up briefly with some future directions. Okay, so in terms of the current state of affairs for HR analytics, this has been long discussed, but we'll just reemphasize this here. In terms of what's happened with traditional HR over the past several decades, historically HR professionals spent a lot of their time doing transactional activities, payroll, timekeeping, things like that, administering benefits and helping people enroll in benefits during open enrollment. And through automation, we have seen that we've actually been able to reduce the amount of time that people need to spend on some of these sort of classic HR transactional activities in terms of the number of people hours, because our HR information systems, our enterprise resource platforms can do a lot, resource planning platforms can do a lot to automate and facilitate those processes. And what this has done is freed up a lot more time for HR professionals to focus their attention on more transformational activities, such as validating their selection tools, evaluating training programs, making sure that their performance management tools are free of bias. And in doing so, they can also hopefully serve as more of a strategic partner for the organization and help HR align its initiatives using data with the initiatives of the organization in order to inform and support the organization's strategy. So what this does mean, though, is that by refocusing HR with these new time that's available now through automation to focus on these transformational activities, is that it means that today often HR professionals are faced with learning new skills and knowledge and developing different competencies. And to that end, the Society, or rather SHRM, Society for Human Resource Management, they have their competency model, and one of the key competencies that they've identified is critical evaluation, which is essentially where critical thinking, logic, and data analysis, management, and so forth live. And so that's a big emphasis of this presentation today, is how do you bring that competency to life? How do you get students excited about that competency and see critical evaluation as something that they can build on their own and through helpful scaffolding, through textbooks, as well as through careful instruction, and how to better prepare them for the changing HR environment. So this also comes on the heels of a rapid acceleration in terms of technology and analytics ability, not just within HR, of course, but across multiple functional areas of the business. And this comes from Josh Bersin, and as he described it, we're kind of at this point of rapid acceleration, or the elbow right now, where we're seeing ourselves accelerate. The technology is increasing very rapidly, our abilities are increasing rapidly, and part of this has been made possible by computational processing power, different software programs that have made HR analytics and data analytics in general more accessible to broader audiences. And so we see this through our enterprise resource planning platform vendors such as Oracle and SAP and IBM, and we also see it through tools such as Tableau, Power BI, as well as programming languages like R and Python, and for more massive amounts of data, platforms and software such as Hadoop by Apache. And so in terms of, this is probably also something I'm sure a lot of you have seen over the past year. Deloitte's been doing this several years now in terms of polling a number and surveying a number of organizations and getting a feel for how they view HR analytics among other emerging areas in HR right now, as well as what they feel about their current capabilities in that area. And so most recently in 2018, Deloitte, as part of their Global Human Capital Trends report, identified that 85% of the surveyed companies rated HR analytics as important or very important, and 70% of those companies reported actively working towards integrating HR analytics into their strategic decision making. However, less than half of those surveyed companies rated themselves as ready or very ready for the HR analytics trend. And this is where we've identified a talent or a skills gap here. And it's students today are at have a really great opportunity to start learning some of these skills so that when they go on the job market, they can help hopefully close some of these skills gaps, or at least have the competencies or the baseline foundation they can work from in order to launch themselves into modern HR positions. So in terms of how we're defining HR analytics here, the way we try to get students excited about this is treating HR as a science and really framing it from that regard. For a lot of students, the idea of the scientific method, the scientific process is something that maybe they learned in middle school or high school and perhaps haven't revisited it since then. So there's some, I would say, a nostalgic effect as you review the steps of good scientific process or method, and often trying to reinforce that this is just really rigorous problem solving that we're talking about here, just applied to an organizational context and specifically to HR. And so we really see this as being the confluence or the marriage between core HR processes and systems and data-informed decision-making to help us arrive at HR analytics as we know it today. Now, in terms of HR analytics, this is a broad conceptualization in terms of not only just how do we acquire and analyze the data, but also how do we report the data, how do we tell a story about the data that's going to be compelling yet accurate, and how do we make sure that what we're doing is actually aligned with the organization's objectives, HR's objectives, and make sure that we're informing and supporting the organization's strategy. And one thing that I've noticed is challenging for some students is they often ask, so what's the difference between HR analytics, people analytics, human capital analytics, talent analytics, workforce analytics, and so forth? And for our purposes, some people might add some more nuance there. We're going to treat these as all or more or less synonyms for today's talk. But we also try to draw in that many of these principles are, although they're getting more widespread attention today, they've been some HR departments have been applying these for years, and industrial organizational psychology has been a pioneer in this area since earlier in the 20th century, bringing some of these, what we now call HR analytics, to life in the support of organizational objectives. And I think more people are starting to get excited about this generally, at least I've noticed with HR students, as data science has become just a very popular term in popular media. And I've seen students who get very excited about the idea of, wow, I've always been interested in working with people and the idea of people, but I'm also interested, I've liked my math and my statistics classes. Is there a place for me? And now with this opportunity in the HR environment, we can start teaching students who have that interest. I've also found that, and we've found that students who you maybe wouldn't expect to have an interest in data analytics as it's applied to HR discover a passion for it. Maybe when they took their math or their statistics class in the past, they never really saw a connection to something that was meaningful for them. Maybe it was more of a theory-based statistics class, for example, as opposed to application with data analysis. And so we see this as a great opportunity to get people excited about something, whether or not they plan to actually be the data analyst on their team in the future. Just understanding these concepts can be really, really illuminating for them. And to that end, we try to bring this to life in the textbook through cases. And so, for instance, we have a case study at the beginning of Chapter 2 on Chevron and how they've leveraged human or HR analytics within their organization to predict turnover, as well as for workforce planning purposes and things of that nature. And so we try to bring in these rich examples so students can understand how this is being applied, what are the commonalities, and how are organizations ultimately using this, as I mentioned before, to inform and support their strategy. And so we usually we do end each case with a number of discussions to help them think more critically about this. We also have some videos too via the online supplement to the textbook, and in which there are different people are interviewed about their HR practices in general, as well as more specifically about what they might be doing around HR analytics. So while this is meant to be a traditional introduction to HR and to human resource management in general textbook, we do try to pepper in and reinforce this idea of HR analytics and data and all the different places where data might exist, and help people think very carefully about how it might be used. So in terms of how we have envisioned training students, we see that there's 4 or 5 general areas that we can focus on in order to train students to fill those HR analytics talent gaps. And so the first is obviously to focus on those core HR concepts that are not going to go away. Understanding what employee selection is as a system, what does it mean to validate a system, what are some of the different legal considerations that we need to focus on as well, which is obviously very important within the HR environment. And in addition, when focusing on HR analytics, we also want to emphasize the importance of gaining technical skills, whether that's through information technologies, statistics, mathematics, information systems in general, having some conversational knowledge at least on what an enterprise resource planning platform is, as well as helping students develop the soft skills, those communication skills. How do they tell a compelling story using the data that they've acquired, they've analyzed, they've managed, and to do so in a way that's actually going to inform or prescribe action. And that gets to the last point. And part of it is trying to help students understand how HR fits into the broader business environment, and how HR can be a very valuable business partner and a strategic partner on organizational initiatives. And so one of the things that we would imagine is going to happen, and I'm already starting to see this happen as I look at different job postings on LinkedIn and so forth for entry-level HR jobs, is I'm noticing a trend where some knowledge of HR information systems, basic data analysis in Excel or some other platform, maybe SAS or SPSS, and sometimes even occasionally R or Python I'll see mentioned in some of these job postings. And so likely the trend is going to be that in the next 10 years that probably most people in HR will be dealing with data directly, and maybe either as consumers where they're evaluating reports or looking at their dashboards. And so it's important for them to get up to speed in terms of to understand what's being presented to them, or to actually do some of the analysis themselves. Now, we've broken it down into these 7 HR analytics competencies that we think it's important for students to learn. One of the most important cornerstones is actual human resource management theory and practice and systems, as well as social science and psychological theory, and helping them use that and leverage their knowledge of that in order to understand and interpret data that they might be presented with, as well as how to ask more informed questions about what initiatives should we target or what problems need to be solved. Now, in addition, we see business acumen as a standalone competency as well. And so traditionally, students get trained very well on these first 2 competencies of theory and business. And then depending on what their interest is, they may or may not have much exposure to data management, statistics, data analysis, measurement, and so forth. And that's where there's a lot of opportunity. We've seen this in the, as Talia mentioned, the HR Information Systems and People Analytics course that we developed and we've taught, that students can very quickly pick up these data management concepts in the context of HR, and they can learn quite a few different statistical skills, data analysis skills. Even for us, we're in the quarter system in just a 10-week term. By the end of the term, they can be applying regression-based approaches and so forth to validate a selection tool and so forth, and I'll actually show you an example of that a little bit later on. And then also storytelling, something as I mentioned earlier, is that something that we would like to emphasize. And then finally, a lot of the traditional programs and ways in which HR is taught focus on ethics and employment law. And we like to take this a step further and focus on specifically ethics and law as it relates to data and the use of people data, human data within organizations. One of my favorite quotes, and I believe it's actually the title of his blog post from last year's David Green, who I believe the title was something to the effect of, don't forget the H in HR analytics, don't forget the human in HR analytics. And so that's something that we try to emphasize to our students as well as in the textbook. Now, the way we see this, and as other people have talked about this, there's a continuum, and there's people that know very little about data, and then there's people who we would call heavy quants that have advanced degrees in computer science, data science, statistics, mathematics, and so forth. And then we have kind of this emerging sweet spot, which is the light quants, people that know enough about the underlying analysis, they know enough about the underlying data, and they know enough about the business context that they can translate between different groups. So from those people that are doing some of the more advanced analytics, they can hopefully pose meaningful questions for them and help interpret what they find. And they can hopefully go to those frontline managers, those supervisors and employees and try to identify potential problems that could be solved, or at least answers provided to, using data analytics. And so this is really this analytical translator role that integrating data analytics into HR courses, even at the undergraduate level, can really be meant to enhance. And so we also like to conceptualize, in order to break down how does a typical HR analytics project unfold, and how can we tackle each one of these different areas as part of this process in order to train students up on it. We like to frame this in terms of the HR analytics project lifecycle. And so it ranges from everything from question formulation, data acquisition or collection, data management, analysis, the interpretation and storytelling component to actually deploying and implementing and prescribing action. And so what I'll do next is work through, partially through this model, to give you some examples of how we've seen this be effectively deployed in the classroom, as well as some examples from the textbook that we've identified on different data exercises and cases and so forth that can bring together different aspects of this, or bring to life different aspects of this project lifecycle. So beginning with this idea of question formulation, I find that this is one of the areas that students, especially by the time they get to an intro HR class, they maybe haven't been doing a lot of coming up with their own questions. Often questions are given to them. And this is very typical. So I think one of the important things is getting them more comfortable with thinking, okay, what are the values of the organization? What are some of the strategic objectives? What are the objectives of HR? And what are some questions that would be good to answer? So meaningful questions where we can find meaningful answers. And this really helps focus people in on doing purposeful analytics versus analytics for analytics' sake. The last thing we want is someone to be sitting down at the end of a dark hallway just typing away, programming away on their computer, just running multiple models that are not necessarily in the service of anything the organization actually cares about. So we want to try to identify and help students figure out what questions are going to be meaningful, and we try to provide them with examples of what is a good question and how do you ensure that that question is aligned with the strategy. And so part of the way that we frame this in the textbook, and this actually comes from chapter 2 where we focus on strategy and data analytics within HR and first introduce these concepts, is we introduce the scientific process. And so in doing so, we're really just, again, emphasizing this idea, it's rigorous decision-making process. And so we start with identifying the problem, which is the way we frame question formulation. So really thinking about how can you identify what the problem is, describe what the problem is, before you start thinking about, well, where are we going to source the data or acquire the data to help find a solution to this problem. Now, moving on to another phase of that HR analytics project lifecycle, another thing that we've found effective is to get students to think very critically about the quality or the integrity of the data. And more often in organizations, I'm hearing a greater concern around data governance, data provenance, as well as data lineage. So not only are the data clean, are they useful, but also where are they coming from? How did they get here? And so being able to tell that part of the story of the data as well. And part of this means when it comes to acquiring good data is recognizing what data is going to be appropriate to analyze. And sometimes, obviously, and this is a hard thing to teach, but I think it's most useful to do this through examples, is showing what happens if you use what we like to call garbage data. If you pump in garbage data, you get garbage data on the other side. In other words, garbage in, garbage out. And so that's something through different exercises and showing all the different ways in which data can become, or they arrive dirty, or that there's improper data validation procedures that have been followed, or no data validation procedures that have been carried out, what some of the consequences are. That we can still often run them through some type of analysis, whether it's a statistical model or something like that, and we might get output. but how meaningful is that output going to be? And I think this becomes increasingly important as we see more and more accessible data analytics software where there's point and click and you can create a model. This, especially with machine learning now, it's relatively easy with some of the new tools like Microsoft Azure to create a diagram and create a machine learning model without necessarily having to think very critically about what is going into that model in the first place. And so again, we like to emphasize this garbage in, garbage out. And so as an example from the textbook, we have a data exercise that we give to students, and the basic background is this. We give them an Excel file, and this is downloadable from the SAGE website, where there's a number of different fields or variables of interest here, everything from employee ID, last name, and so forth, their job level, facility, start date, and those types of things. And really, these are somewhat arbitrary, but the point is to illustrate all the different ways, or at least some of the common ways in which data come to us and need to be cleaned. And so here's a screenshot from this. This is actually from Chapter 3. And as you can see, we have the fields presented here. And if you do a quick scan, let's say with the start date column, you'll start to notice that, oh, wow, there's one entry, all of them, or a lot of them seem to be in a standard date format, and then a couple are written in as June 6th. With actual, the word June written out, as well as July is in there. And so helping students recognize that our programs aren't going to be typically smart enough to know what we meant. And this is something that I think is best taught through example. And so we show them in this exercise, they can walk through and learn how to use just simple Excel tools, data validation tools, as to identify different out-of-bounds values, things that are unrealistic that perhaps someone entered by error, as well as set data validation such that those values that would be out of bounds will be recognized and they can be addressed. And we also show how to use filters and things like that, and even pivot tables in order to identify some of these issues and then to clean the data where possible. Now, next, as we move along that HR Analytics continuum, we like to focus, as many people do, on distinguishing between descriptive, predictive, and prescriptive analytics, where descriptive is typically the HR metrics or describing something that's already happened in the past. You're looking at past data, and often these are things that are commonly reported in decision support dashboards or manager dashboards that HR professionals and consumers of HR data might be using. And then predictive analytics, we're moving on to the point where we are taking data from the past, creating a model, using that model to predict future events, and then validating that, that model using additional data down the road. And then with prescriptive, we're taking what we know from descriptive and predictive, and we're actually prescribing action, a plan of attack for people based on what we found. And so we'll start now with descriptive analytics and give an example of how we've seen this effective or be effectively deployed to students to help them understand what descriptive analytics even means. And so, for instance, one exercise might be to simply calculate annual voluntary turnover rate for an organization. Often these things are automatically computed for us in a lot of our platforms today, but it's sometimes helpful for students to see, one, how simple these calculations can actually be, and what's the underlying math. And I think it gets them a little bit closer to what's happening, and then when they can do that, it starts to make a little bit more sense to them in terms of what, for example, a turnover rate even means. And so here's an example from Chapter 10, where the focus is on employee retention and turnover in that chapter. And as part of the data exercises, we give them some sample data. They work through, do some very simple Excel formulas and computation, and they arrive at an annual turnover rate. And again, this is meant to just illustrate for students how simple some of these metrics are, and hopefully to, if any of them are coming into this with any kind of phobia around numbers, or if they have concerns about their general data literacy, we can hopefully kind of lift the veil or elucidate what's really happening most of the time. And usually these descriptive analytics are relatively simple to understand and compute once you unpack them. Now, moving on to predictive analytics, this is, well, I'll say in the textbook, this is an entry-level Intro to HR textbook, so we don't go into true predictive analytics in the sense of actually cross-validating the findings or having training data sets that then you ultimately develop your model on and then apply that model to a test data set. What we do is set them up for what I like to call predict-ish analytics. It's almost predictive analytics. You've done the first step, you've identified or developed a model, and then that could be deployed again in the future. So for example, we could use an equation or a model derived from based on regression to predict future applicants' job performance based on their selection tool scores. In other words, just employee selection tool or assessment validation, criterion-related validation specifically. And so in the textbook, we also have an example with the data exercises where we give them some sample data where the criterion is customer service, so that's the performance outcome we're interested in predicting for presumably some type of customer service job, and we give them some backstory to provide some of that rich qualitative context that helps them interpret the findings and to make it more meaningful for them. And then the students get to practice estimating the criterion-related validity of the different selection tools, which in this case is a proactivity personality inventory, emotional intelligence inventory, and a situational judgment test score. And in doing so, we walk through the free add-on package, the stats or the data analysis pack add-on for Excel, show them how simple it is to point and click through setting up a regression model, and ultimately to receive output from it. And so we work all the way up to a multiple linear regression model where we can introduce this idea of statistical control by having more than one predictor variable in the model. And so this is not meant to give them, obviously, complete fluency in this, but this helps them gain that sense of mastery where, again, it helps when they hear the word model, and specifically a regression model, they'll have a clearer understanding of what that might mean in the HR context and why that might be valuable. And this can be really helpful when they're working with vendors and vendors start using the word algorithm or model so they can start asking questions about, well, maybe what are the underlying approaches that were being used to actually estimate the data. Now, kind of a common thread that we apply through everything, as I alluded to before, is this idea of ethics and legal issues. And one of the questions we like to kind of back students up at all times, so as they're going through their rigorous problem solving, their scientific process, is to have them think and take a step back and engage in some type of ethical decision-making framework. And really this can be distilled down to just because you can, should you? And so and this has become increasingly more important with how much access we have to employee data today, as well as with data privacy and security concerns, which are a couple areas that we like to focus on quite a bit in the classroom as well as in the textbook. And so when students take a moment to pause, sometimes they realize, oh, this is something that, yes, we could scrape the data. We have this new scraping tool, for example, and I'll show you an example of that in a second, or perhaps we could choose how we want to display a data visualization to an audience of people who may not know much about data analysis or data analytics. And so there's a lot of control that comes with that and a lot of room for ethical decision making as well. And so here's a classic example that we present in the textbook and in chapter 3 we do a whole section on data visualization in an HR context. And this actually comes from the early 80s, a study that Caughlin and colleagues did, where they found very simply, if you scale the Y and the X axes on a scatter plot to make them larger, so on the left you'll see kind of more of a standard scaling, and then on the right image you'll see that it's actually been scaled such that the Y and the X axes have much larger scales. People tend to perceive that the scatter plot on the right is displaying a much stronger association than the one on the left, even though they're based on the same underlying data. And so again, this comes down to this idea of what is our responsibility as analysts and how can we teach students to start thinking about these issues critically, because sometimes this becomes challenging when some platforms we use, maybe even Excel, plots and so forth, that they have these default settings. And so thinking very carefully about when do we override those defaults in order to express something more authentically and more accurately, and so people can really use it to make more accurate decisions. And as I mentioned a second ago, also, it's really incredible all the tools we have access to. In Python and R today, and I'm sure there's other platforms that make this readily accessible, you can scrape data from websites fairly easily. And so then the question becomes, okay, just because you can do this, you can gain access to this information, should you do this? And so throughout the book, we have different spotlights on legal issues and ethical issues where we turn students' attention to that to emphasize that there's a big responsibility in HR to be good stewards of the data. And another example that we arrive on as well as far as a spotlight in ethics is the use of wearables and fitness trackers and what the implications are for data privacy as well. Now, moving along with that HR analytics project lifecycle, after they've analyzed the data, they've managed the data and so forth, it's time to interpret the data and tell a story around the data. And one of our colleagues who teaches our storytelling course in HR, she likes to break it down to the 3 C's of storytelling, of communication, connection, and clarity. So helping students develop those skills of what is a clear story, what is a good story or narrative structure, and how do you make sure that the story is appropriate in terms of the length. And so what I've observed is that students often want to focus on 10 different things in a 10-minute presentation, and instead getting them to focus on 2 or 3 things that they can communicate and add some repetition in to reinforce the ideas, as well as how do they establish that connection? How do they communicate clearly with an audience that might not know as much as they do about HR in general, as well as about data analytics concepts? Or how do they communicate with an audience that's going to know a lot about the technical aspects or maybe the legal aspects and so forth? And so being aware of their audience and being able to communicate effectively and tell a story in that way. And so we do show through data visualization, we have an exercise as part of the textbook as well, where we have them compute in chapter 11, where they calculate compa ratios for different employees, and we show them how simple it is to calculate that. And then we have them create a simple scatter plot in order to see if there's any type of linear or nonlinear pattern that could be indicative of perhaps pay compression or salary compression or even inversion. And so here we're just having them plot tenure on the x-axis and compa ratios that they've computed on the y-axis here. And just showing them how data visualization can be a great way to understand the data. And again, this can hopefully help them ask better questions as they start to examine and explore the data they have access to. Now, to finish up, we do see some future directions for HR analytics, some of which we've already discussed today, but I do want to emphasize that what we've observed is ethics is of course going to be an ongoing conversation, and as we have new tools, as more people have access to these tools, I think that it's going to be incumbent on HR instructors and those who work in firms to communicate to both their students or their employees the importance of being good stewards of the data and to think very critically, what ought we do in this situation? Given what we know, what are the prevailing standards, and where are there legal gray areas that we need to fill in using ethical decision making? And then the next thing is wearables. I already mentioned that with fitness trackers. There's a number of opportunities, especially in the area of workplace safety with different sensors people can wear that can detect noxious gases, as well as personal protective equipment like hard hats that can detect impacts and concussive forces. And so how can we use those data? And that introduces a whole new challenge for HR, especially when it comes to how often those data are live streaming, they're quickly streaming, and they start to get into that realm of what often people would call big data. They might not be structured in a way that's going to be ready for analysis, and that's where good training on data management comes into play. In the textbook, we talk very briefly about blockchain, as this is a very quickly emerging technology, and it's starting to be discussed in terms of applications in HR. And so it'll be really interesting to see how this shapes up in the next, I'd say, 5 years or so, how blockchain will potentially shape the way that maybe payroll is done in organizations, and as well as other things that I think we haven't even thought about yet in terms of potential applications there. Still, I think there's great value in students understanding traditional centralized databases, relational databases, and that tends to be most of the emphasis within the textbook is what are some of the key concepts around an HR information system or database management system, and what does it mean to centralize your data and so forth. And then finally, kind of a new, or not a new frontier, but an important frontier is how do these things trickle down to small and medium-sized organizations? Large organizations have a number of luxuries, often in terms of having sufficient sample size to run more advanced types of analytics and even move into the area of machine learning. But with smaller organizations, they can sometimes be limited depending on what it is that they're investigating in terms of what types of analyses are going to be appropriate. But with that said, it's pretty amazing what some of the new platforms that are available for small and medium-sized enterprises, and specifically with HR information systems today, that can be great tools for small and medium-sized organizations. And so I think seeing those tools continue to develop will be really interesting in the future. And to that end, we do in the textbook have a pop-out in every chapter that specifically focuses on how not just HR analytics, but what does HR look like in small and medium organizations? And in some cases, we will offer some evidence-based best practices or some different considerations for small and medium-sized organizations. So just to wrap up, we talked about the current state of HR analytics, brief definition of what HR analytics is, and then spent most of our time talking about what training students looks like and what Talia and I have found to be effective in the classroom. And I should add that we taught this both in person and fully online, and we found that it can be done in both ways. And one thing I will say is that having careful tutorials laid out for the students, such as the ones we provide in Excel for the textbook, can be really, really helpful. And sometimes it might seem like, wow, this is 20 steps long, but we've found that students really like having less ambiguity when it comes to doing these more technical things. And so that's one thing that we found quite effective, is having a clear tutorial for students to start with is really critical in terms of eliminating that barrier to entry for them and hopefully getting them very excited about how to apply this and how it might even shape the trajectory of their career for some. And then we finish up talking about some future directions. So at this point, I'm going to pass this back to Sarah and unshare my screen here. And this might take a second here. And Sarah, can you see the screen now?
I can. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David and Talia, for your informative presentation. Now we're going to spend some time addressing your questions from the audience. So if you guys can please continue to send them in through the question box on the right side of your screen, or you can use Twitter with the hashtag SageTalks. We'll try to get to all your questions by the end of our time, but if we can't, we will address them after this. The speakers have agreed to do a follow-up blog post, and we'll post some of the questions and answers on our Sage blog called Sage Connect. Okay, so let's get started. David and Talia, can you talk about the benefit of this approach for non-HR majors who might be taking an Introduction to HRM course?
Absolutely. I have a few anecdotes and I'll just share one of them. I think this is a great marketing area for HR right now. One of the best students I've ever worked with, I worked with her the past couple of years and she graduated this past year. I remember she took my Intro to HR class as an undergraduate, and she was taking it as an elective because at the time she was a supply chain and operations major. And so she would sit there in class and she was interested, but she was someone that at least outwardly did not express a lot of confidence through her body language, kind of just like physically would kind of hide herself in the classroom, but engaged, wrote excellent, did excellent work in the class. And then about halfway, or about 4 weeks into the term, when I introduced the first data exercise to the students, she lit up. And then we had some more data exercises, and we used the independent samples t-test to evaluate a post-test only with control group training design. Very simple. I simply simulated some data. It's much like one of the examples from the textbook that we use today. And that got her so excited that she switched majors. And she had always been interested in psychology and humans, and this was the bridge she needed to get into HR. And so from that point forward, she ended up taking my more advanced HR information systems and analytics course. And over this past summer, she was creating tutorials in Python and teaching herself. I taught her R in another course, and she's really run with it. So I think there's that side, is getting people who maybe didn't ever think about HR as being an area they'd get into, helping attract them. The second area is that I find people from different functional areas, it's a way to, I think, from outsiders' perspective, help lend credibility sometimes to HR, because often I find with accounting and finance students, and supply chain as well, they want to see data. And so this is a way for them in their eyes to say, oh, this is not that it wasn't legitimate before, but in their eye, they needed that kind of connection. So I think this is something that can really bring this to life for other students. And sometimes those students from other areas bring some really outstanding technical skills and quantitative skills that they've learned through their other areas of concentration. Talia, did you want to add something?
Yeah, it's funny. I'd written in my note credibility. I think that's the huge one. If we think about HR, we're relatively late to the party in dealing with HR and with analytics in HR, where marketing and finance and operations have always had a lot more numbers and analytics associated with them. So I think what you described as the bridge is what I've seen. Students are much more open to HR being important and kind of rigorous when they see the cases and the hands-on exercises. So it actually, I think, has been helping. It's probably the bigger thing is, as you said, somebody coming into HR because they love the H, the human, to say, okay, this is going to help you be more able to help individuals. So for them, that's the bridge. For people in other areas, it's like, okay, I get it. We care about people because that's going to help us be more effective in business, and I see that you're speaking in a language I can understand. So I actually think it's a win-win.
Thank you, Talia. Another question we have is, can you talk more about the H in HR analytics and how data and analytics can benefit employees and people in organizations?
Absolutely. One of the themes that we run through the book is, and this is partly because I believe all of us as authors of the textbook, we have engaged in research in occupational safety and health, is that we do give many examples throughout the textbook of how data, and well, just HR in general, how it can be used to address employee well-being, employee safety, and outcomes related to those, and focusing on employee engagement. And so that's not only are we looking at these organizational outcomes like preventing turnover and things like that, but we're also looking, we also focus quite a bit on the importance of fit in organizations, as well as in one chapter we talk about even applicants' reactions to different selection tools and procedures and what the consequences can be like that for people who don't perceive those favorably. And so that is something that I try to emphasize in the classroom quite a bit, is making sure that they always take a step back and realize that there's people behind this, and then asking very carefully, well, one, do people know that we're using their information like this? That's an important thing. And then two, in what ways can this help benefit the employees in our workforce?
I think absolutely. As you mentioned, a lot of us do research in the area of safety, and we also have a fairness lens. So a lot of us do fairness and justice kind of research. And I think that's a way to think about it. I think it's intuitive to say, well, I care about people, and that's one-on-one. And so I like Barb. She does a good job. I'm going to give Barb a raise. And if I just use cold numbers, that might not be as good for Barb or for me as a manager. And an example is kind of an extreme example, but it's one that's kind of a feel-good example. Google used a lot of analytics to understand what was going on with their workforce, and as a result of that, they actually determined that what they needed to do was give not just Barb a raise or a few people a raise or a certain job category, but they engaged in what they called the Big Bang, and they gave everyone across the organization a 10% raise. Now that's a nice story, and not everyone has those resources, but it is an example of how we maybe make assumptions about how numbers don't help people or hurt people. They do hurt people, they're not going to help them. But I don't think that's necessarily true, and I think the more that we can share those good examples with students, the more they get to see that actually being systematic and rigorous and having high quality data to inform decisions is really very fair, and it's really a very nice way to support the humans in the HR.
Absolutely, and just to quickly add on to that too, that's a great point, Talia, about fairness and justice perspective, and related to that is the idea of bias and as well as potential discrimination, and also bias within our tools that maybe we're not aware of. And so that again gets to this idea of data acquisition, integrity, and measurement. And that's something that I think a lot of us have a tendency to do, and I think especially students as they're first getting into this, is they see a number and they assume that that's truth. And so helping them understand that there's a human behind, for instance, the supervisor rating of performance, and as part of performance appraisal or evaluation, and helping them think critically, well, what are the different sources of bias here? And how can we uncover that using analytics and help triangulate whether or not we think that a tool that we might be using might have bias in terms of being injected into the data, that then if we go to analyze those data, we're going to end up with biased results on the other side. And this, I'm really pleased that I'm hearing this discussed much more broadly now, the idea of algorithmic and model-based bias and how bias that enters into some statistical or computational model can actually be amplified on the other side. And so I think that's something, and I'm very pleased that this is now into the popular culture, that people are more aware of this.
Thank you, David. We have a whole bunch of questions, so I'm going to move us on to the next one. Question is, how do you deal with the great range of readiness or aptitude among students for the key concepts in analytics?
Sarah, could you repeat that question, please? I didn't catch the first part.
Sure. It's how do you deal with the great range of readiness and aptitude among the students for the key concepts in analytics?
Oh, that's an excellent question. That is very excellent, because it is often quite a bit of range. And you know, some of this, in terms of the readiness, goes all the way back through grade school, and I do get the impression that some students have experienced, but I don't know, it's somewhat traumatic experiences with math. Maybe they take a statistics course in high school or something like that, or maybe even in college, as well as computer science if they've been exposed to that. And so I think that's one of the things, is trying to first create this sense of psychological safety that it's okay, this is kind of a sandbox, you can learn how to do these things by doing, and these are things where we're all going to make errors. And so creating a safe environment, I think, is the first way to kind of, again, reduce that barrier to entry for everybody. And then the second thing is to understand that people will move at different speeds, and this is where I found that, and Talia and I experimented with this, and now it's turned into more of an official program, is having students who really get it quickly start coaching other students. And this is part of our learn, do, teach model, so they learn it, then they start doing it through some exercises, and then those students who move really quickly through it, and you may be worried that they're going to start getting bored, you have them start teaching other students in the class. That helps them teach it at a much more rich level. And then the students that they're teaching get the benefit of having a peer who's just learning these concepts themselves, who can recognize what are some of the common things that they didn't understand, given how close they are to the phenomenon, start giving often a really good explanation. And so that's something I would really recommend as well.
Yeah, I think part of it also is thinking about, you know, kind of that literacy, the fluency, and the mastery. Not every student is going to want to get to really being fluent and mastering this, but every single student should have literacy. And so if what you find is a majority of your students are on that end, it might be of great value to spend time there and having extra credit exercises for people who want to do a little more hands-on. And so it's understanding, doing that needs assessment with your group, but then being able to move them up in terms of their ability level over time. A couple other things that David has done that have been great is creating kind of boot camps. So what are some basics that students can take to help them along the way get the basics, and tutorials. And so those are things that might make sense depending on what you're trying to do. If it's just a few students who need to catch up, that coaching example works as well.
Okay, David and Talia, another question we have is, how do you teach students to deal with the outliers and missing data?
That's an excellent question, and that's something that with the undergraduate level, I tend to punt on that a little bit because I make them aware of this. And so when we're going through, we'll look at some of the diagnostics and so forth. But the data I typically simulate for them is going to be very clean. It meets the statistical assumptions for whatever model that they're running, if it's an inferential statistical model, and a parametric one at that. And then with the graduate students, though, that we're teaching in our HR Analytics graduate certificate right now, we get much more in depth into outlier detection. And in that particular coursework, we're teaching them via R, so we show them different functions and packages that can be useful for diagnosing outliers, different types of diagnostic tools that they can use that are fairly readily available, and then helping them. It's, the trickiest part is no, we're never going to fully meet or have 100% confidence that we've met statistical assumptions, or what exactly is an outlier versus what is not an outlier. And so I focus a lot on the role of decision-making and judgment calls, and have them focus in on documentation and to clearly describe and keep notes on why did they remove this outlier, what's the reason for it, was there a way to correct the value, was it typed in or entered inappropriately to begin with, or is it just someone that's perhaps not part of the population of interest that somehow ended up in the data set, and then having them back up to the research question, okay, what is it you're trying to answer, and does it make sense to eliminate this case, or is this something that we should keep in? So I think it's the documentation, it's giving them the tools, but typically, again, at the graduate level for sure, with the undergraduates, I've found that can quickly get very overwhelming for them when they're just trying to learn what a regression model is, or what a t-test is, or analysis of variance. And so backing that up into, or just keeping it more focused on kind of toy examples that are going to be very clean, but making them aware, if you're going to do this in real life, it's going to be way messier.
Thank you. Okay, I think we're almost here. I have one last quick question for you, David, and that is, what is your take on using platforms like DataCamp to teach undergraduate principles of analytics?
So with DataCamp, I'll admit I'm not too familiar. Occasionally I'll peek on there to see what approach they're using. I think one of the things I've noticed with some of the modules that are available through platforms like that is that they can vary quite a bit in terms of how much information and structure they give and how much context they give to students. And I think those can be great tools, but I think they often, at least within an HR context, it's useful to scaffold it and to surround it with a rich context. So we're having issues hiring the right employees, so we need to identify better selection tools or validate our existing selection tools. And so creating some perceived need for them, a reason they should be doing the analyses, I think can really enrich that experience for them. And I think that I'm sure those DataCamp tutorials can be really excellent if scaffolded. And again, I haven't done a good look at many of them, and so there could be some that are doing a great job integrating context already. But that would be my suggestion, is to supplement them with a rich HR context.
Great. Thank you so much, David. Well, we're just coming up on time here, so I would like to thank David and Talia again for your presentation and your time. It's been really informative. I know we haven't been able to get to all the questions. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Again, a special thanks to David and Talia. We will be making this webinar available. And for the questions that we haven't gotten to, I know somebody is asking if they will be able to get the Q&A, and we will provide the questions and answers along with the webinar afterwards. So please be on the lookout for those emails coming. Please stay connected with us on our blog, Sage Connection, for more information about upcoming webinars. And that's it for today. Again, thank you everyone for joining. If you have any other questions, we would be happy to try to answer them in our blog contact. And again, to David and Talia, thanks for your time today, and we hope to talk to all of you again soon.